The Call of Duty franchise is one of gaming's most successful and influential products. Every year, players from all around the world are waiting eagerly for the newest installment to drop them into fictional battlefields and intense, action-driven set pieces. The situation is no different this year, with fans of the series waiting for Modern Warfare 2 to be playable. And while most of the game's long-term success is clearly grounded in the multiplayer department, they also come with a single-player campaign that is not to be underestimated for a number of reasons. The Call of Duty campaigns have largely shaped how action-oriented sequences in modern shooters are supposed to look like and helped develop a style that is reminiscent of Hollywood levels of production and presentation. That being said, despite their commercial and critical success, these campaigns have also been subject to varied forms of criticism, ranging from sexism, putting the players in the position of terrorists, and Russian complaints regarding unfavorable portrayals. In this video essay, I would like to take another area that is highly problematic, yet which has gone largely unnoticed and/or undiscussed. Today, I want to talk about the portrayal of the Middle East, the use of Orientalism, and its function with regards to the righteous, just war of the Western sphere. My name is Chris, and this is Gamer's Delight. To start with, it may be a good idea to remember the purpose of Call of Duty single-player campaigns, and that is not to specifically comment on political, ethical, social, or religious issues, but rather using the somewhat familiar in a constructed virtual environment to place the consumer in exaggerated binaries of good versus evil and just versus unjust. However, in doing so, these stories rely on outdated ethnic stereotypes and a heavy Europe-American bias, so much so that they become a caricature of the Western propaganda that has been present in other forms of media for decades and centuries. As I said, it may not be the game's intention to misrepresent, stereotype, and exaggerate, but the intention is not really what counts. Indeed, the fact that these issues may as well stem from the authors' and developers' unconscious bias shows us just how powerful these images actually are, thus proving why it is important to be aware of what we're consuming. Naturally, I'm not the first person to call out the franchise for its problematic portrayal of the other and its use of Orientalism. However, the series has arguably changed with the release of 2019's Call of Duty Modern Warfare, which sought to fight the game's reputation and subsequently adopted a more subtle approach by promoting what the publisher considered a more truthful depiction of contemporary warfare in the Middle East. However, I argue that the use of Orientalism still rages high and remains central to the game's fundamental DNA. We should start by defining Orientalism, as it will be used as our analytical framework throughout this video. Originally conceived by Edward Said, Orientalism is a Western style of dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. The latter is not to be understood as a geographical location, but rather as an idea that has been given a history and tradition of thought, representation, and imagery, a construction of the West to produce and reproduce imperial logics and actions. This Western way of thinking about the Orient has long been identified in every sphere imaginable, ranging from mainstream academic scholarship over political discourses to media representations. Coherent with other forms of othering, Orientalism imagines the Orient and its inhabitants as a uniform and inherently different sphere from its Western counterpart. The inhabitants are depicted as Islamic, backward, irrational, and violent people to form a dichotomous idea compared to Western societies, which claim to be liberal, free, and peaceful. This dichotomy ultimately serves to promote and justify the presence of Western forces in the Orient to help these people who would otherwise fall into a world of tyranny and violence. Since 9/11, Orientalist discourses have shifted noticeably and increasingly promoted the link between Islam and terrorism. Ever since, Islam has become a culture of death and destruction in the public eye, which once again helps justify Western action and involvement in the Orient, and even an increased use of domestic surveillance and violence when the Oriental danger threatens the homeland. It should be said that while most agree with at least certain parts of Said's theory, it's also often been criticized. The greatest issues are the ahistoricism and the lack of precision and documentation in Said's work, for whom Orientalism can only be committed by a Westerner and who views every Western criticism of Islam as a sign of Western superiority. That being said, it remains a highly useful framework to analyze Western media and can help us categorize differences in representation. The fact that Orientalist dichotomies have shaped our understanding of the Orient is evident in the visual representation of the Middle East in video games. 2019's Modern Warfare is set in the fictional Middle Eastern state of Urzikstan. This is a continuation of a prevalent media trend in which Middle Eastern states are excluded under the premise of wanting to avoid getting wrapped up in the politics of any specific real-world country, as the game's design director Jacob Minkoff put it. The decision itself, however, stands in stark contrast to the readiness with which Western countries are represented in these games. While the games proudly parade the flags of the West in its quest for freedom for everybody, thus naturalizing their existence and purpose, the Islamic states remain constructed and foreign. Visually, the dry and wilting wasteland that Urzikstan is once again epitomizes Orientalist depictions of the Middle East and serves to characterize the Orient as devoid of natural beauty and life. Unlike the West, the Orient is a geographical void, politically and culturally underdeveloped. The cities of Urzikstan are bombed-out places that are host to no other life than to that of Islamic terrorism. These desolate, lifeless cities become no more than a virtual playing ground for the player where no regard for the wider surrounding is necessary in the first place. These places are noticeably devoid of civilian life, which prevents any form of humanization of the other. The only scenes depicting human life in the Orient take place in the US Embassy, which is subsequently attacked by terrorists. The embassy, a place of order and organization, embodies the rationality of the West, which is then contrasted by the irrationality and violence of Middle Eastern terror. Compare that to the construction of Western cities in the game, which are not only representations of actual nation-states, but also far more true to life. In the game's second mission, terrorists attack London, the heart of the UK and for many non-European consumers, the heart of Europe. All of a sudden, the threat of Oriental violence and irrationality is no longer confined to the Orient, but becomes a conceivable threat in the domestic sphere. The consequences of violence against civilian life are much more pronounced in this case, as heroic policemen help players defeat the terrorists, while the mission ends with the remark,
"This shouldn't have happened in the first place, sir."
Home, a valuable and meaningful entity for every Western person and seemingly non-existent for those in the Orient, where the consequences of war, violence, and terrorism aren't meaningful enough to be explored. Similarly, games can vary wildly when it comes to the representation of those fighting in the war. While the combatants of the Middle East all serve a monolithic misrepresentation of Islam, the military personnel of the UK and US are symbols of the multi-ethnic liberal ideal. In 2019's Modern Warfare, the fighters of Al-Qatala are uniquely Arab and Muslim, thus rehashing the all Muslims are Arabs and all Arabs are terrorists stereotype. All inhabitants of the Middle East are either terrorists themselves or, at the very least, terrorists by affiliation. The monolithic representation and dehumanization of Muslims as an international enemy ultimately serves to legitimize Western violence and excuses any potential collateral damage. And as the Orient is a backward, patriarchal society in need of Western values, the inherent differences between the West and the Middle East carry over to similar spheres like gender and ethnicity. Females from the Middle East are hardly present in the game as is, and when they do appear, as in a raid in Camden, they serve to reinforce notions of female subordination in accordance with Orientalist representation of Muslim women. The presence of Western forces in the Middle East suddenly is no longer only a war on terrorism, but also a fight for global values and human rights. The war, which therefore should be interpreted as a just war because it is legitimized through this rhetoric of universal freedoms, readily undermines these efforts in reality, none of which is ever touched upon in any of these works. Since we're talking about contemporary shooter games, violence is an inherent part of the game's ludonarrative framework. However, here too there are clear contrasts when it comes to which kind of violence is deployed, the reasons for why it is applied, and the consequences of its application. While Middle Eastern violence is inherently brutal, irrational, and evil, the violence deployed by Western forces is just, clean, and governed by necessity. The fighters of Al-Qatala are motivated by religious fanaticism, which turned them into murderous animals with no possibility to compromise or seek ways apart from violence to achieve their goals. Naturally, the underlying political, social, theological, and economic roots of modern-day violence in the Middle East are completely ignored. The UK and the US, on the other hand, side with the ULF, a group of freedom fighters that seek to liberate Urzikstan from the Russian-backed Islamic control of Al-Qatala. No other geopolitical or economic motivations are ever considered. The Western forces are only involved for entirely altruistic reasons. The type of combat and violence also differs massively when comparing the Orient and the West in modern shooters. Al-Qatala combatants are determined fighters, so much so that they're willing to sacrifice themselves for their cause. From a modern, Western perspective, this martyrdom is nothing short of irrational and stands in contrast to the secular worldview of the West, in which irrational and superficial entities like God have no room. Suicide terrorism contradicts all liberal, rational norms and becomes even more dangerous and frightening because there is no nation-state controlling this form of violence. it cannot be confined and thus robs the state and rationality as a framework of their power. In ordinary combat situations, the primitive nature of the Orient becomes tangible as the player is given the newest and most modern weaponry and equipment to kill countless amounts of faceless terrorists, while your American fighters rarely die on screen. The use of modern, supposedly clean and precise weaponry is also contrasted by the use of chemical weapons and makeshift equipment by Al-Qatala fighters. The use of these weapons, which are prohibited by international law, once again authorizes Western intervention in the Middle East and further demonstrates that powerful international actors are able to set the boundaries of permissible violence to maintain supremacy. The pinnacle of the supposedly clean warfare by Western forces is the use of modern, high-precision drones. Lethal and impersonal, it is argued that these drones fall within the ethical guidelines of a just war because they are in accordance with the principles of proportionality and distinction. In reality, of course, drone strikes have repeatedly violated these principles. Ever since President Trump banned reporting on drone casualties in early 2019, precise figures are hard to obtain. However, a report from 2014 stated that in an attempt to kill 41 individuals, the US killed as many as 1,147 other people. Regardless, drones, and by affiliation their usage in games, are considered humane, rational, and modern, and therefore act as an antithesis to the perceived archaic violence of Middle Eastern fighters. Of course, Call of Duty is not the only modern video game series which continuously resorts to Orientalist depictions of the Middle East, but it is one of the most successful and influential works to do so, and I have little reason to believe that the next installments will fundamentally change in that regard. As I said, the misrepresentation of the Orient may not be a result of bad will, but it is a problem that very much has consequences in the real world. It reinforces age-old stereotypes that have traditionally been used to help establish control over the Orient. I'm aware that change does not come overnight, but it takes a lot more attention from both players and developers alike to improve the representation. And I know that Call of Duty campaigns don't necessarily strive to be standout narratives that long to become a force for good, and for some people it may be hard to imagine how we can get away from misrepresenting the Middle East in a way that ultimately indicates Western dominance and rule. However, there are films and games that have successfully proven that the narrative forms that we know can be tweaked to improve the nature of the representation. Be that as it may, there is still a long way to go. Of course, no player is at fault for playing and enjoying these stories. After all, they were produced by and for this exact market, and they remain fun games to play. However, we should all collectively remind ourselves to ask why certain characters, groups, ethnicities are portrayed in certain ways in games and other media to become more aware of intentional and unintentional bias.